Okay, good evening. Welcome to the latest version of Building the Scottish State. And I have the great pleasure to have with me MP Lisa Cameron with me this evening. And we want to talk about, well, whatever comes up, but certainly about mental health in Scotland. What are some of the current trends, and what might independence bring in terms of a change of policy on mental health? So first of all, thank you for being with us this evening, Lisa.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay. Well, first of all, just give us a little bit of your own personal history. About your education, how you became interested in independence, in politics, running for office. Just give us a kind of a brief bio, if you would, please.
Yeah, Mark, I mean, it was never a plan, Mark. I have to say I'm probably the accidental MP in that regard. I worked in the NHS in Scotland as a clinical psychologist for 20 years, both within mental health, in learning disability, and also in the forensic service, so that's criminal justice aspects to my work as well. I was an expert witness, and I did a lot of risk assessments for some of the really serious serial offenders across Scotland who were held under the lifelong restriction with the Risk Management Authority orders. So I came to politics. I suppose I'd always been interested in it. I was also a union rep with Unite for many years. You don't really speak about politics too much when you work in the NHS. It's not the thing. So it was never something that was sort of openly discussed in that sense. But when the referendum happened, everybody became involved. It was something that we all had to form our views on, decide where we were going to sit in terms of being pro-independence or not. And it was at that point that I got really engaged in the Yes campaign locally.
So prior to the 2014 referendum, basically.
Yeah, and just prior to that, I felt, really it was a time in history that we had to all become involved, and even those of us in professions where we wouldn't usually become too directly involved in any politics of the day, it was important to look at the different arguments for and against. I'd always been an SNP supporter, but it hadn't been something that was openly known, and at that point in time there was also a group of healthcare staff, psychologists for Yes, so I was also involved in that, and I was involved in a number of union groups as well who supported the Yes movement too.
Okay, all right. And when did you first get elected to the Parliament?
2015, so it was May 2015, and since then we've had a subsequent 2 further elections.
I know, great.
Busy time.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So tell me a little, what do you see as the primary issues regarding mental health in Scotland at this point? How would you assess the system such as it is, and what are the drawbacks, and what are what does Scotland do well? What do they not do so well? Just give us kind of an overview of the mental health situation in Scotland.
Well, you have to sort of look at it, a bit historically in a sense. So when I first worked in mental health, it was really quite common to have waiting lists to see a psychologist, for instance, for mental health treatment of 12 months to 18 months. So obviously that didn't give good access to a service. When the Scottish Government came on board, they looked at waiting times, and that has been reduced to what should be around about 18 weeks. That's still not perfect, but it's a massive change from where we were, and that's meant that there's had to be a huge amount of funding put in place, training put in place, and to look at a sort of tiered system of when you come into primary care, what level of mental health supports do people need at that level? If they're to be escalated to community mental health team level, what level of support's needed there? And if people need very, very specialist psychological input, then a stepwise progression in a tiered way so that people can access the part of the service that most fits their needs. And that's been developed over time, and it's come a long way. Are we where we want to be? Not yet. And I do think the COVID pandemic has probably escalated both the mental health issues that people have been grappling with. There's been so much more bereavement, loss, anxiety to cope with. There's going to be a lot of anxiety about the economic situation as well. And so mental health, has been described as something like a tsunami coming down the tracks, as part of the COVID recovery, and will be part of the recovery for much longer, possibly even than the physical aspects of COVID.
Okay, and tell me a little bit about the system. I mean, you work for the NHS. Now, is there both a public and a private mental health care system, or is it exclusively public, or how does that work?
Well, within the NHS, that's public, of course. If people want to pay themselves to see a private consultant, then there's always been the capacity to do that. But, the real value of NHS Scotland has been that there hasn't been the same level of privatisation whatsoever as we've had, within NHS England, and that, it's very much psychologists, mental health staff, mental health nurses working within the NHS system that provide appointments to patients in each of the health boards, and those are managed locally in terms of local need, but in the majority of cases, people do still opt for public NHS service rather than a private service. Obviously, we want it to be an equal society, so we don't want people who can afford to be getting something that others can't access. So it's very, very important, I think, to people across Scotland that the NHS does remain in public hands.
Okay, and is that threatened at all by the internal market bill? I mean, I haven't looked at the content of that, but are Scotland's powers imperiled, in terms of the control over the NHS and these things by the internal markets bill?
Well, there are some aspects of it that are reserved, and we always have to be very careful of that. So my colleague on the health team down at Westminster, Dr. Philippa Whitford, has been.
Yes, I interviewed her the other day. Yeah.
Right, so she's been looking at that in great detail, and she's been looking at aspects of it in terms of data management for people's data, also aspects of who can become on clinical board members in NHS England, etc. So private companies like Virgin Healthcare are able to sit on some of those boards in England. We don't want to be going down that track in Scotland, so she had to be extremely careful in terms of looking at that legislation and any potential knock-on impacts to Scotland, because sometimes precedents are set and then we have to look at it. I think from trade, international trade as well, whether or not we join certain trade agreements and what access that would then give to private companies is also another issue that has to be really seriously looked at, and make sure that we safeguard our NHS. And sometimes we don't have all of the powers to do that, but we have to be able to point it out to the public. We have to be able to point out the risks, and we have to make sure that we're voting in the right way and safeguarding.
And what are the reserve powers that have some limitation on what you can do in Scotland in terms of because health is devolved, but what are some of the reserve powers that potentially can limit the capacity of Scotland to reform or to improve the mental health system or the health system more broadly?
A lot of it is based upon funding consequentials, so that there are limitations around that. So if we wanted to massively expand access to mental health, that would then we'd have to look at different aspects of the budget to see where that could then be taken from. So there are very significant constraints upon the Scottish Government, and also in terms of borrowing as well, that there's no capacity to do that. So the financial constraints are there to start with. But in terms of shaping the system, I would say that it's been really innovative. We were the first part of the United Kingdom to look at those waiting time directives and to put them in place for mental health services. There is parity of esteem for mental and physical health, and we're looking very much at a broader system, looking at well-being as a concept, and that's not just about healthcare. That's about dealing with poverty. It's about dealing with homelessness. about dealing with the environment that people have around about them, access to play parks, etc. Those types of aspects of our everyday lives can create well-being and are very preventative in terms of mental health. If you look at it in terms of a continuum rather than being in good mental health or bad mental health, you have to look at, well, where is the population sitting on the continuum, and how do we enhance well-being across the population? And those are some of the aspects that I've been really looking at. How do other countries internationally do that, particularly those who have very high levels of satisfaction, life satisfaction, such as Denmark? What are the components of that, and how can we shape that in Scotland? And those are some of the discussions that are ongoing, but that we also want so many more people to become involved in and to be.
Sure. And what are some of your ideas on that, of making Scotland fundamentally a happier place? What types of things can be done in your view? Especially after Scotland has all of the powers that are. What are some of the ideas that you've had, that you've been discussing with your colleagues?
Yeah, so we're looking at life balance with the workplace, and how that can be reshaped, and perhaps, continuing some of the working from home or the flexibility round about that wherever possible. Looking at, the ability for people to spend real quality time as parents with children at very early crucial stages.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Looking at the environment that people have in terms of green space and a real green recovery, because we know actually community cohesion, people being able to build those social connections and having that local social support, it's actually come really to the fore during the pandemic, and we know how important that is. And those are some of the aspects of well-being, but a really significant part of it is also greater equality within the system, and really dealing with poverty and childhood poverty, and those aspects that really need to be grappled with, particularly in some of the most deprived areas across Scotland in particular.
Another thing I would add to that is the quality of the food that's consumed. I mean, when I spent time in Scotland in the early '90s, I was just amazed at how much grease, the chippy, the family I was staying with basically had a pan of oil like that, and they would fry everything in oil, and people were, it was like a funeral a day. I mean, people just, dying at like 50 after a heart attack, and seeing the way a lot of people ate, it's kind of unsurprising. But the problem is that the availability of good quality food is limited, especially in more deprived areas. And so even getting people to eat better is often more expensive. So that would be something that should be, could be addressed.
It's funny that you say that, because the quality of Scottish produce is just, of such high quality and of excellence, and that's renowned throughout the world. But we really need to be able to make sure, just as you say, that people who live in areas where there's high levels of deprivation, they have the choices and the ability to access fresh foods, that school dinners are fresh, and have the best quality produce, that we're helping parents with really basic things as well, like financial education, but also budgeting. And that sort of subject that I had at school that I'm not sure that it's done so much now, but home economics, being able to cook something from scratch, because we've become, just like most of society, very fast food orientated, very microwave orientated, and actually many people that I worked with in mental health didn't actually have the skills to make a good meal for themselves, and so some of these very basic parts of education, I think, are just so fundamental, and we need to make sure that those are the ones that we help particularly parents with in terms of generational education and learning.
Okay. All right. And what do you see as the fundamental things which could be different in an independent Scotland in terms of, mental health? And what are, what powers that Scotland doesn't have now would be beneficial for reforming and, improving the mental health system in Scotland?
Yeah, well, obviously the power to be able to protect the NHS is really fundamental, and the power to be able to borrow and to invest in services is also fundamental to building, a really successful, flourishing nation. Scotland doesn't have those powers. It doesn't have the powers also to, negotiate its own trade agreements with other
Exactly.
parts.
Yeah, I know, and that's, and I work with a group where we've got what we call the Scottish Sovereignty Research group that I've started, and and I contacted EFTA. I got in contact with the Secretariat of EFTA, and this was prior to the election, in May of the Holyrood election, and he basically said if Scotland has the powers to, if the Scottish government has the powers to negotiate treaties and the powers to abide by them, Scotland could be in EFTA within weeks, and potentially be back in the EEC within a couple months. Whereas so that opportunity is there. It's just that but the Scottish government needs to seize it, and I don't know how that's done. But but as I said, this EFTA representative made it clear that Scotland has the power to negotiate treaties and the powers to abide by them, that they would be welcome. So yeah. I hope.
Well, I think that's really fundamental, isn't it? And the ability to build a flourishing nation and to be able to sell that great produce that we have, to be able to ensure that we get the best possible deals in Scotland for our fishermen, for all of the industries that we have, that are really shining examples of high quality, that we're able to harness the great potential that Scotland has in terms of hydrogen, in terms of wind power, in terms of our natural resources as well, and to be able to reduce that inequality and poverty and create a more socially just society where people have not, as Margaret Thatcher had said, that individualistic outlook, but that real outlook of caring for each other and being there for each other. And I think actually one of the few things we could say about the pandemic that has been something that's come to the fore that's been perhaps positive is community cohesion is very much there, and we know that we can build further upon that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And we touched on something in our discussion before that about the kind of the psychology of independence, and I'd really like to kind of pick your brain on that. And as I mentioned before, I spent some time in Scotland in the early '90s, and politics was just not something you discussed. It was something that was very hidden, and because you don't know whether the person you're talking is on the other side of whether Catholic or Protestant or whatever. And so, as far as I'm, politics just wasn't really discussed, and coming from an American background where everybody talks about it all the time. But then, since then, since the referendum, it's really opened up and people are much more, but what do you think about, again, the psychology of independence, and why, for me, back in 2014, I was like, why wouldn't you vote for independence? Of course. But I was just kind of amazed at the again, a lack of confidence on the part of many Scots and other things that kind of tell me, what else can you add about kind of the psychology of independence and what kind of people need to get over in terms of supporting it?
Certainly to build that confidence that you've been discussing. And I think there's been messages, perhaps cultural messages for many, many years. And it's always a kind of saying, you're too wee and too poor and too stupid. Actually, Scotland is an amazing country that has an abundance of skills, an abundance of talent, and an abundance of natural resource that can really be capitalised upon. So I think it's about having those discussions and building that confidence. But also the psychology of any change, whether it's discussing statehood or whether it's change within an organisational structure, there's always going to be people who are very pro-change naturally, who like change, who adapt very quickly, and then you're going to have people who are really tied to the status quo, and that's been working for them. And then you have those in the middle who are looking at which way things are shaping and flip-flopping, and those are the ones that will probably shift, because those who are tied to the status quo and to the union are likely to maintain their position. So in terms of the psychology of moving people towards independence, I think it's that group in the middle who are not closed off to independence, but perhaps have concerns about, day-to-day living issues, or, the concerns about, the things that have been raised, things like pensions, things like how courts would be managed, all the things that are very natural to bring up and want to discuss and to have answers to. So those are the things that we really need to be doing more and more work on, and have more and more discussions on with people, to make sure that we're moving in the right direction, and bringing people with us who are open to change. Because as I say, we know from psychology that there are people who like change, who can see the benefits of change and who go very quickly to change. There are others who are very resistant to change, and who may, despite any arguments, stick to their position. And then there are those in the middle who are the ones that are open but have to be convinced. And I think those are the ones that we have to really focus on and harness. The anxieties, address their anxieties, but harness their confidence in moving towards independence.
And what role do you think, the role, being British, being part of the union, under the monarchy? I mean, it seems to me as if, that was something more in the preceding generation, maybe people of our parents' generation, that would have been more kind of, attached to the idea of the union. But I don't think there's any question that, the people, younger people see it very differently. I mean, support for independence among young people is, very high compared to the older people. But what kind of residual effect do you think has, allegiance to the union? What role do you think that still plays?
I think it can be very family-based, quite cultural in particular parts of Scotland as well. It can be linked with cultural aspects as well. It might be linked with sports. It might be linked with membership of organisations. So, there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that people know an independent Scotland would be a very inclusive, independent Scotland. Everybody would have a place at the table, would be involved in discussions, and that their views would be, and their anxieties and their concerns would also be taken seriously and taken account of moving forward. So I think you're right that there has been a sort of generational difference in terms of feeling a real attachment to independence. It's been more difficult for others, but then you have to remember that older generations have perhaps come together and have been involved in worldwide conflicts together, and that some of those aspects and that perhaps still is significant in their mind too. But I think these are really there's debates and there are issues that we have to acknowledge, and we have to speak to people about, and we have to let them know that an independent Scotland is an independent Scotland where they have a voice and where they can help to shape the future.
Okay, and how do you think is the best way to go about that? Assuming independence is achieved, sooner the better, obviously, but within the next couple of years, I don't know, who knows how it's going to pan out, but assuring that that Scotland be designed in a way that is inclusive and more democratic and I'm just wanted to get your ideas. I mean, I've been since I'm involved, I've been very a strong advocate of having a written constitution that guarantees certain fundamental rights and provides a coherent governing structure with which Westminster distinctly lacks. But what do you think? What are your ideas on how we go from where Scotland is now into being what Scotland can be, and not having it slip into becoming just another Westminster or just another just another oligarchy, you know. So how do you see that in terms of constructing the state and making sure that these qualities that you advocate of being more inclusive and democratic are actually realized?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that the vision for an independent Scotland would be one where, you know, people are democratically elected, so there wouldn't be a place for a body such as perhaps the House of Lords in that setting, where there would be a second chamber. It would be, you know, hopefully people who are democratically representing the communities, and also who are perhaps experts in certain fields as well, who can bring that great level of expertise to policy making going forward. I think in terms of making Scotland, you know, a real democracy that we can be proud of, I think the Scottish Parliament has come such a long way in terms of, you know, giving us that confidence that we've spoken about, making us aware that we can take a different direction from Westminster, that we can have a society that cares for the most vulnerable, and that's actually a really positive thing and something that most people across Scotland would adhere to as an excellent principle. That, you know, we will have a society that makes sure that people with disabilities are fully included and at the table, and that they're able to shape policy, and people with mental health issues as well. You know, so it's about making sure we have these citizens' assemblies, that we have representation. I think in terms of statehood, there's always going to be the legal aspect, the political aspect that perhaps is going to be, you know, ironed out at the Scottish Parliament level, but then there's also got to be that grassroots level of cultural identity, of shaping of institutions, of looking at inclusion, and making sure that people have voices and that they have input into an independent Scotland, and how to shape that moving forward. So I think the citizens' assemblies are going to be important. I think the various groups.
And what was and I know there was a citizens' assembly that met over, you know, pre-pandemic, and I gather that the report has been done, and I mean, I'm just wondering what's being done with the citizens' assembly that's already occurred.
Yeah, I've not been directly involved in that, but I do know that that's something in terms of Scottish Government manifesto that we want to be taking forward in terms of really more hot topics, issues of the day, where it's going to be about getting communities involved, making sure that we shape things in the way that people want to see moving forward. And I think, you know, in terms of binding the grassroots, that was one of the things that really got me enthused and involved in the independence debate in the first place. It wasn't, you know, so much politics at this high level. It was about having that chat to people in the street, speaking with people in the workplace. It was about, you know, having this frontline involvement in what I could see as a really aspiring nation coming forward, and the possibilities of that. And I think that we have to make sure that civil society is fully involved going forward in that process.
And given the attitude of the media, particularly in 2014, with the way the newspapers were always just poo-pooing, you know, another blow to Alex Salmond, all these terrible things are going to happen, all these calamities will befall Scotland if they become independent. What do you think? What do you think are ways that we can, you know, get around the media to a large extent, and have much more fruitful, discussions and debate over independence that's not limited by the BBC and the other pro-union media?
Well, some of the work that you're doing, podcasts, this type of work, I think is really crucial to moving things forward. It's about social media as well as mainstream media, but we also have to be engaging with media as well, because often they may be bringing up valid concerns that people have who perhaps don't support independence, and we can't shy away from those conversations either. And, you know, an independent Scotland, I would never say would be a perfect Scotland. It's going to be one where we learn, and we, you know, the importance of that is making our own decisions, not letting our neighbour take the reins and do that for us. So it's going to be a process rather than an instant thing. And I think that we have to make sure that we do harness everybody's potential right across Scotland and have those discussions and involve as many groups and people as possible. The mainstream media, I think, as I said at the start, when you have change, particularly within a state, you're always going to have I suppose, aspects of power that are welded to the status quo, and it's a bit about, trying to build communication there, as well as making sure that we have well thought out arguments and in order to counter the valid issues that are brought forward.
And also, I think that going into any new referendum, I would think that there needs to be a lot more information given about what Scotland would be after independence. And I'm in my view, if that was lacking in 2014 to a large extent, irrespective of the 500-page white paper or whatever, it just didn't seem to me as it's always if they wanted to defer the big decisions until after we get independence, and then we'll decide on whether to keep the monarchy or this type of thing. And in my view, I think that it would be better if there was a lot more substance, during a campaign or even prior to independence. There's no reason these types of plans can't go on, even short of independence. So I'm just, what do you think, what do you think should be proposed in terms of, how far can people go in terms of defining what a Scottish state would be, prior to a referendum? What do you, I know that's kind of a convoluted question, but what are your views on that? Just in terms of, presenting beforehand, before any kind of ratification of independence, what the state will look like.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're presenting is a vision as well, isn't it?
Sure.
But you do have to have the groundwork put in, and that's why it's so important, actually, that parliamentarians across both parliaments engage internationally with those in the UN, at the EU, look at the issues of agreements that could be taken forward in the future, that we build those connections and communications, because it's not just about building a Scotland that people here would accept. In order to get that statehood and recognition from the United Nations, we also have to be able to convince those internationally to recognise Scotland as an independent state. So some of those discussions have to be internal, looking at vision, looking at binding groups and ideas, and harnessing potential and producing papers on the various issues that Scotland, how that would evolve. Much of it will be changed or progressed once Scotland is independent, depending upon successive governments, obviously. But the other aspect of it that perhaps isn't spoken about as much is not just about what happens in Scotland, but also the international aspect of that and the gaining recognition, which is really, really important in terms of gaining access to finance through the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, the ability to protect our borders, etc. So those are also aspects that the Scottish Government has to work extremely hard on, and that parliamentarians across the parties have to be able to have the scope to try to build those relationships, so that internationally there isn't so much resistance coming. And
do you know to what degree that work has been done? Because in our group, actually, we've reached out to a couple. One of my colleagues is friends with the Icelandic president, and also I've been in contact with through a colleague with the Norwegian government, just to kind of get their views on it. And the basic view is that as long as it's done democratically and peacefully, there'll be a lot of countries that recognize Scotland. I mean, it seems to me as if there's this thing, you're with Great Britain and they don't want, people, they don't want countries just to be able to become independent like that. But I just think that I'm just wondering, to your knowledge, what contact have parliamentarians had with other governments, and what kind of feel do you get for, whether or not Scotland would be recognized?
That's a really crucial part of the work that, you know, certainly was started at Westminster. I was in the Foreign Affairs group between 2015 and 17. You know, I'm since moved to the health group, so I'm not as directly involved with that. But certainly when I was in the Foreign Affairs group, that, you know, at that point it was led by Alex Hammond, and that was something that was very much fundamental and significant to the work that was being done from Westminster, was building those connections, reaching out, you know, building communication internationally, and on a path towards that recognition. So Alan Smith is leading up on that now in terms of the Westminster group, and I'm sure he'll be able to tell you about the work that's being done there. I certainly know from, you know, the work I'm involved in terms of leading the Chile group in Parliament, and you know, some of the delegations that have been on through the UK Parliament, that people and internationally, ministers, etc., in other countries, are always very interested in where independence is at. And they're aware of it. They're wondering when the second referendum is going to happen. They ask you about it a lot, and so those communications are really key, because if they know the people involved as well as the policies, then there can be a level of certainty involved internationally as well. And what we don't want is, you know, what we hit the last time, which was, you know, a huge amount of significant resistance, you know, being openly spoken about, you know, from leads of other countries, etc.
Well, certainly, and certainly the, you know, the EU, you know, that in 2014 it was said, well, if you leave the UK, you leave the European Union, and then lo and behold, in 2016 they voted to leave, and Scotland's leaving. You know, despite that, and at the time there was, oh well, you know, Spain will veto it or whatever, and you know, and it just seems to me as if, you know, I mean, Brexit has put things in a completely different light, and I think a lot of countries are like, you know, we'll recognize you, but you got to make the moves for yourself. You have to. Scotland has to find a way to you know, to get independence. And I think that a lot of them would follow. You would recognize it, especially given Brexit and the you know, and the lower esteem that the UK has held in given its behavior during the, you know, during the Brexit thing. So I'm just putting forth that I think that there's a lot. I think there'll be a lot of welcoming for Scotland, but Scotland has to take it upon itself to.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely, and that's why I'm saying there's the political legal aspect that's being led on, you know, by the First Minister and the group at the Scottish Parliament. There's also the cultural aspect of it, and the, you know, the sense of nationhood and building those foundation blocks across our communities that has to involve and harness, you know, from the grassroots up. And there's also that international aspect that we're building. And I think you're entirely correct. I think there's a feeling that the United Kingdom is becoming much more insular with Brexit, but there's a sense that Scotland is as it's always been, very internationalist. And you know, for goodness sake, we've gone all over the world and invented many things and created you know, so many wonderful things you know, that we all rely upon in day-to-day life. So we have the capacity, the potential, and Scotland's also always been very international.
Oh, Scotland has a fantastic brand. I mean, as an American, you know, the difference, you know, if someone's English or Scottish, it's a completely different reaction, you know, when you meet someone from Great Britain. So it's, I mean, you know, and I think Scotland is, you know, I think that despite all of the kind of neoliberal indoctrination that's taken place over the past 50 years or so, that has made, you know, entire societies much more, you know, much more greedy and much more, you know, self-centered. I think the Scottish people have been able to keep a very high degree of solidarity and compassion and empathy that you don't always find, you know, in different people. So, you know, yeah, and is that go ahead.
No, what I would say as well is that obviously England are our neighbours too, and you know, a massive part of the communication and the ongoing working relationship would be with England and the rest of the UK as well. So, you know, building those relationships down at Westminster in particular, is quite fundamental to people knowing who they're dealing with and what things would shape up to look like in the future, and having a sense of confidence too. But I think you're entirely right that some of the arguments that were put forward in 2014 have been completely eradicated now. And in hindsight, people are thinking that, that they shouldn't have listened to those scaremongering stories. And I think the interesting thing was that, for the Brexit referendum, many people didn't listen to the scaremongering from many of the people who were saying that Brexit would be a disaster. But actually, Brexit will probably be much harder for people in the longer term than having chosen an independent Scotland, which unfortunately we haven't done as yet.
Mm-hmm. And what are the effects of Brexit? I mean, are there like food shortages now in Scotland? I mean, I see pictures of empty shelves, and I mean, if that's the case, then it's not going to get any better, until Scotland is able to join its own trade agreements and get back in the EEA. How do you see that?
I think COVID has probably mitigated some of the initial impact of Brexit from people's minds and their day-to-day lives. However, I do know from speaking to haulage companies within my constituency and from speaking with the organisations who represent them, that there's a real shortage now of haulage drivers, that goods and services being passed up and down through the United Kingdom is being very, very difficult for some things, and there's queues obviously again. The government in the UK Parliament are having to look at this. I wouldn't say there's shortages just now, and I would certainly never scaremonger, but I would say that there's certainly less choice for some things that were on the shelves.
Okay. All right. I'd like to get some of the questions now. Let's see. Let's see. So, has there been a study done to find out the impact of the 2-child cap on our families with young kids?
Well, Alison Thewlis MP is doing a lot of work on that. I'm not aware of any particular studies, but I'm sure there have been. She would be the person to ask about the 2-child cap. But what I would say is that obviously, families who have who struggle financially, who then have a bigger family, it might be for religious reasons, it might be their own personal choice, shouldn't be placed at a detriment in a democratic society, and we should be looking after all of our children, and having a good family base is actually the foundation for much of the well-being that we were speaking about, and able to give people those skills and the support when they need it at a very early age is absolutely crucial to mitigate much of the trauma that we see in society, and that people sometimes grapple with for the rest of their lives in terms of mental health. So I think a good early years and early start is absolutely fundamental to good well-being within any country, and that's something that Scotland takes seriously and that we want to move forward upon, but that things like the 2-child cap undermine our ability to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Because living here in France, I mean, both my former wife and I were both public employees, teachers. And when we were having our firstborn, Laurence was able to get off, most of the time, as a teacher in full pay. And so I was able to spend a huge amount, a very large amount of time with my boys, especially early age. So, that's just made such a huge difference in both our relationship and their own, mental well-being, so, okay. Well,
it's very cost effective as well, if you think about it, because, people might say, well, giving people maternity and paternity leave and having it paid, etc., that's a huge cost to the economy. Actually, over the long term, on the NHS, on the criminal justice system, on social work services, it's a massive, saving, and we need to make sure we're supporting children and our population and giving them the best start. I think it goes without saying.
I'm just a comment about the royal standard and whether I'd support the monarchy. No, I have that up there, but I believe Scotland should be an independent republic. I don't think there's any place for there's this rigid caste system that pervades the UK in Scotland. Okay, let's see. Are there going to be more nurses employed to help with the backlog of COVID? As far as you know, is the Scottish government ramping up hiring of nurses and healthcare professionals for what will inevitably come? And
there has to be further investment in mental health professionals in particular. We know there's a shortage in learning disability nurses in particular. People with disabilities have been disadvantaged to such a great degree during the pandemic right across the United Kingdom. There needs to be investment there. It takes a long time to train staff. So what we're looking at is a tiered system where when people have very, very complex and high level problems, they'll be able to see consultants, psychologists, etc. At an earlier stage, there might be an applied psychology practitioner, or there might be mental health nursing staff at different grades. And it's going to be like a tiered system so that people can access it at the point of where they most need.
Okay. All right. How many therapists or doctors have left Scotland because of Brexit? Has there been a diminution of medical staff because of Brexit? Presumably because a lot of European citizens may have been working, and now with Brexit they've left. Or
we looked at this when I was on the Health Select Committee. Basis, and the government was accepting that healthcare staff, doctors and nurses were leaving, and the answer that was given often in those sessions was, but we'll be able to attract people from developing countries to come and fill those gaps. But we have to remember that developing countries, if we're thinking about Africa, India, those countries who need their own health resources, we shouldn't be, undermining their health systems too. So there has to be more training, from my perspective, in the UK, in Scotland. There has to be more funding put in place so that we can have mental health professionals and trained here, as well as taking mental health professionals from other countries wherever needed. But that shouldn't be at the disadvantage of some of the most vulnerable countries in the world.
Okay. Can you tell us about the value of Scotland's total budget for your portfolio? I'm assuming she's referring to mental health, but I mean, do you have any idea? Can you give us any information on the amount of money that's spent on mental health?
I haven't got the absolute top line figure. I know that there's going to be much more investment in drugs, rehabilitation in particular, another lot of money from Angela Constance is going to be, we're going to be looking at that. What I would say is there's no one answer to that particular issue. We've been looking, I used to work in drugs and alcohol, actually. There has to be harm reduction aspects to it, which when we were looking at I suppose when you were looking at HIV and when you were looking at hepatitis, that was about needle exchanges, etc., methadone. So there has to be, the government's looking at consumption rooms and the ability to do that kind of thing, because some of it's reserved. So there's going to be funding put into those aspects, and there's certainly going to be work and policy taken forward there. In terms of rehabilitation, another £150 million put into rehabilitation beds. That's going to be really, really crucial because people who have significant drug and alcohol problems go round a change cycle. They don't just get better and then that's them for the rest of their lives. They have relapses, they need to dip in and out of services, but they also need, when things get really crucial and critical, to be able to access rehabilitation beds, and that's something that I think is going to be very, very important to save lives moving forward.
Okay, and can a lot of this be done with Scotland still in the union, because if for example drugs are a reserved power and the Scottish government cannot, does the Scottish government have any taxing powers, or is it completely dependent on Westminster largesse? Or is Scotland able to borrow money at all, or is that?
We could increase taxes to a certain degree, but not borrowing powers. Borrowing powers are, it's
but do taxes go to the Scottish government, or does because I saw that Scotland was able to vary some of the powers, but doesn't that tax go to the UK anyway, or is there tax revenue for the Scottish government that it can raise, or what do you know about that? Because it's kind of confusing, because as I understand it, Scotland can't borrow any money. So they're dependent on the budget of the UK budget that's paid to them, but they don't have any powers to borrow. Is that your understanding?
Well, my understanding is that borrowing powers, particularly during COVID, etc., that has been about the budget that's been set at the UK level.
Somebody just said it was Scotland can borrow. The Scottish government can borrow 500 million a year. That's just just a comment I saw. So but anyway.
Right. Well, I mean, there's certainly tax-raising powers, but obviously, you're looking at how to make society more equal as well, and government has looked at some of those aspects in terms of tax-raising, but you're finicking around the edges because you don't have those borrowing powers. You don't have the ability to set the level of funding that you would like for each aspect. Of what you're doing. You don't have the ability to improve your trade, your international trade. You don't have the ability to create those aspects of your economy that are just so fundamental to an independent state. So there's very much working within restrictions in terms of devolution.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Why don't we have a fresh produce agenda for our schools and to educate our children how to eat and be healthy? We were discussing that earlier, but particularly in the deprived areas.
I'm very pro that kind of thing, and I'm doing a lot of work on. I chair the Health All-Party Group at the UK Parliament, and I think that's something that we really need to be doing. And actually, when we looked at the sugar tax, when I was on the Health Select Committee, and the industry was very much against that. Do you know what they was at? That's what industry does. It wasn't the great calamity that it was said to be, but it's very, very important because there's so much sugar and salt and processed foods that are just so instantly available to people, particularly in the most deprived areas. If you walk from street to street, you see a higher incidence of takeaways, etc. We need to be able to teach people at a very early stage about making meals, about good fresh produce, about the value of sitting down actually and having discussions with family over a meal as well. Those types of aspects of society that when we've been rushing about in our busy lives, and I think COVID has helped to reset some of that, we realise just how fundamental and important it is to our well-being to have the basic building blocks, to have those connections, to be able to have time with the important people in our lives, to be able to have contact with them. We had never had that taken away before. So some of these aspects of quality of life, I think, are much to the fore, and we need to do a lot of education in schools as well, around about financial education, but also I would say I agree with you about nutrition as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Should an independent Scotland have more referendum to gauge public opinion, similar to Switzerland? Do you think that Scotland should be able to have more referendums around different issues once independence is achieved, and the Scottish government could set up different referendums for different issues as they do in Switzerland?
Well, potentially that's one route to take to determine some of the issues that you've been speaking about, so far, such as whether or not an independent Scotland would wish to retain a monarchy, whether or not they would wish to rejoin the EU, etc. So those may be some aspects of more complex policy making that could be looked at in a referendum, or could be looked at in other ways to take that forward and make sure there's the most inclusive policy making undertaken to make sure that people have their voices heard.
Okay. All right. And how much more, how much need will there be for more mental health doctors in independent Scotland? I mean, would you say there's a shortage, or do you think that there needs to be, what, I don't know, double or the number of doctors that currently are in order to meet the society's needs?
Well, I wouldn't give a figure such as double or something like that. I've been down at Westminster now for the last 5 or 6 years, so I'm not so much on the front line. We do need increased staffing. There's been a lot of staff burnout as well, and actually staff's own mental well-being has been impacted dramatically through this pandemic too. So we can't expect our staff to continue, without having additional resources. I think that would be unrealistic. But there's also new things coming forward. So I was really, as part of my work, I lead up on some work for the British Psychological Society. I was at the launch of Avatar, which is a new online therapy for people who hear distressing voices. There's a lot of innovation and technology that's going to come to the fore as well. And I think through the pandemic, we've actually got a bit better. I know I have. We've got a bit better at using technology and therapy.
Yeah, we have no choice.
Therapeutic techniques are moving online as well now, so there's a lot of innovation happening. So not everything will require a doctor or a nurse per se, but there will be different levels of intervention based upon need.
Okay, and there's a couple questions on regarding this, but what is your view on drug legalization and how, or whether that would be part of a solution to for the drugs problem, or we were speaking about that earlier, but what do you because there's been a lot of information recently in the news about how drugs have become an epidemic in Scotland, and many are dying because of that. I mean, and we mentioned, what is it, the rooms where people can go and safely take heroin or whatever, but what are your views on possible solutions to the drugs issue?
There's no one solution to the drugs issue. You can't say, well, having injection rooms would, be the one final solution that we need. I mean, I don't personally agree that that's there's no magic wand for that. The injection, safer injection rooms, there's never such a thing as a safe injection room, but having an injection room where there's medical staff, where people are injecting, they can have medical intervention at a very quick pace, is a harm reduction approach to that. What I'm saying is we also need treatment approaches to that, in terms of why are people using drugs? What trauma's in their background? What impact is it on their mental health? How has it impacted upon the families? We need to be doing much more holistic work around about that. And when people are in crisis, they do need access to rehabilitation beds, and they might need to be admitted for that. And that's costly, but what cost is a life? That has to be undertaken, in my view, to save lives as well. And the criminal justice aspect, you're talking about the legalisation or decriminalisation, has been a discussion that's been ongoing for a very long time. I don't think it's the answer in itself. Certainly there are some models worldwide we could look at where that's been more effective. But what I would say is, in Scotland just now, where people are using drugs for their own purposes and they're not selling drugs or supplying drugs, then actually they're not usually arrested and charged for that. So there's not that. It might not be that we have the exact system where we're looking at it in terms of completely health-based rather than criminal justice-based at the present time. But what I would say is that in the main, there is that need for rehabilitation alongside harm reduction, alongside the holistic, interventions that are going to help people move on from drugs. We've had people on methadone for years and years and years right across the United Kingdom. That doesn't help them to move on from being a drug user. It helps them to reduce the level of crime associated with it, but they need the actual treatment intervention to help them to choose a different path, to come off the methadone, to have a different lifestyle. And those are the parts of the puzzle that I think are most fundamental moving forward.
Okay, one more question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. But what do you think about Scotland, independent Scotland, having its own pharmaceutical industry?
Well, I mean, I think an independent Scotland would have all of its own industries to some degree, and pharmaceuticals would be part of that, obviously. And you know, so many different aspects of our life today have been invented in Scotland. So much of the great research and clinical work is ongoing at our universities, linked with pharmaceutical discoveries. Dolly the sheep, for instance, is one of the ones that people often speak about. You know, so we have great scientists. I'd like to see more women going into those fields. We have great scientists. We have a great capacity for research and for discovery and innovation in science and technology. And we need to have the levers to make sure that that potential comes to fruition.
Yeah, I think the key to that would be in a constitution or something like that, making sure that the money that's invested in the public sector into research, that the people, that there's popular benefit from that. Because you know, for example, the internet was basically developed by the military industrial complex, you know, but millions of dollars over the years in the 60s and 70s to develop the internet. And then once it's developed, they you know, gave it off to private corporations, and they're making huge amounts of money from it. Whereas the investment that created the internet was through the public sector. And so something that, you know, if research is conducted and leads to, you know, a widespread benefit, that the money from that benefit comes back into the public sector rather than being siphoned off by some, you know, greedy pharmaceutical companies. So, okay, well, anything you'd like to say before we say good evening? Just, you know, kind of resuming what we've said, or would you like?
Yeah, just that, you know, we have spoken about how important this stage is. I think in Scotland's history, it's really crucial that the political and legal aspects are taken forward at Scottish Parliament level in terms of moving towards independence. It's really important that we strengthen the cultural aspects of that, the confidence building that we've been talking about, and the discussions and debates about the questions people still have about what an independent Scotland would look like and the concerns that they have. And that has to all be done also at a grassroots level. And I think what I would say is that please contact me if you're interested in the psychology of independence moving forward. That's something I'm doing.
Okay, can you give an email or something where people can...
Of course. You can get me at Lisa Cameron SNP at outlook.com. I'm going to be looking at the journey of independence, not just for Scotland, but, you know, internationally. Many countries have become independent. What does that look like? What are the triggers? What are the components that get them there? And how do they overcome some of the obstacles? Because we can learn from others, as well as, you know, thinking about how we want to see Scotland.
And what not to do as well. I mean, just from a, you know, being from an American perspective, I mean, the Constitution was basically written, you know, by the elites, so that for the benefit of the elites. And the U.S. government has never really been in the business of, you know, making people's lives better. There was the 30s when they had the New Deal and the 60s when they had the Great Society. But otherwise, I mean, the federal government is just pretty much worthless for, you know, in terms of actually making, you know, programs to make people's lives better. You know, I mean, the case in point would be the healthcare industry, which is privatized and, you know, ridiculously expensive. So, you know, we can learn what not to do as well.
We can learn what not to do. Although I would say, as a plus for the US, that I did watch an excellent program on First Ladies and the contribution they've made, and Eleanor Roosevelt in particular, I think, was a real shining example of listening to people, taking on board their views and values, and trying to get that into policy moving forward.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us, and look forward to welcoming you again in the not too distant future.
Thank you so much.
Okay.